Under those circumstances, anyone guilty of seducing lost souls, be it in the media, madras, or mosque, into the clutches of this religious dogma, could have been identified and punished. Ignoring Islam and going after Al-Qaeda is akin to targeting Hitler's SS instead of Nazism, or targeting the kamikazes instead of the belief system that turned them into suicidal killing machines. If we continue to fight the symptoms of this disease, like the fascist Ba'ath Party in Iraq and organizations like Al-Qaeda, the real villain, Islam, will manufacture more terrorists than the world can endure. And while I do not advocate murder, the most compassionate thing we could do is to silence, sideline, and defang Islamic clerics and warlords in the context of a justifiable defensive campaign to prevent them from sending thousands, if not millions, more to their doom.
Tabari and Ishaq. Allah's apostle besieged the final Jewish community of Khaybar until they could hold out no longer. Finally, when they were certain that they would perish, they asked Muhammad to banish them and spare their lives, which he did. The prophet took possession of all their property.
Before you look at this as an act of mercy, allowing the people to live that he had nearly starved to death, you should know that it was really economics. By getting the Jews to surrender, Muhammad claimed the entire spoil for himself.
Ishaq. When the people of Fadak heard what had happened, they sent word to the messenger asking him to banish them and spare their lives, saying they too would leave him their property. When the people of Khaybar surrendered on these conditions, the survivors asked Muhammad to employ them on their farms for a half share of whatever they produced. They said, "We know more about farming,
seeing that you Muslims are terrorists and all."
So Muhammad made peace with them for a half share, provided that, if we want to expel you, we may. He made a similar arrangement with the Fadak, so Khaybar became the prey of the Muslim, while Fadak belonged exclusively to the Messenger of Allah, becoming his personal property, because the Muslims had not attacked its people with cavalry.
Prey is an apt description of what the Jews were to the first Muslims, and it was to be a never-ending assault.
Bukhari. Umar expelled all the Jews and Christians from Arabia. Allah's apostle, after conquering Khaybar, thought of expelling Jews from the land, which, after he conquered it, belonged to Allah, Allah's apostle and the Muslims. But the Jews requested Allah's apostle to leave them there on the condition that they would do labor and get half the fruits the land would yield. Allah's apostle said, "We shall keep you on these terms as long as we wish." Thus they stayed until the time of Umar's caliphate, when he expelled them.
I realize that this is hard to believe. It's so inconsistent with our view of prophets and religions. Yet the bloodied and broken bodies of the Khaybar Jews, like the Qurayza before them, reveal what Islam does to men. Pure, fundamental, original, and uncorrupted Islam turned men into terrorists. They became as immoral as the beast who seduced them. As additional proof, I offer one of the most startling hadith in Islam.
Bukhari. The Prophet told an Ansar, "Choose one of your slave boys to serve me in my expedition to Khaybar." So he chose me, even though I was just nearing puberty. I served Muhammad when he stopped to rest. I heard him saying repeatedly, "Allah, I seek refuge with you from distress and sorrow, from helplessness and laziness, from miserliness and cowardice, from being heavily in debt, and from being overcome by men."
This is how Muhammad saw himself. It is what he had become. Muhammad was stressed, helpless, and lazy. He was a miser. Never having actually earned a dime in his life, Muhammad had no way to value capital or labor. He was always in debt, no matter how much he stole. The economic plight of the Islamic world is a direct result of Muhammad's unwillingness to engage in honest labor. It is why the Islamic nations remain the world's least productive. In fact, Muslims as a whole are destructive economically, stifling far more commerce than they inspire. And that's because their leader was a pirate. Islam was financed with stolen booty in the slave trade. As parasites, they survived by sucking every productive host within camel's ride dry. The Bedouins of Arabia were poor, and while the Jews were a tasty treat, Islam would soon sink its fangs into a more plentiful prey. Within a year, Mohammed would attack the Byzantines. Within 3, his companions would subdue Arabia in the War of Compulsion, taxing everyone. Within a decade, the first Muslims would conquer Yemen, Persia, Egypt, Syria, and Judea. Within a century, the sword of Islam would be wielded above the necks of millions, and it was all for money. They had plundered and raped, to be sure, but the principal tools were the zakat and jizya taxes, which they imposed on all people, rich and poor. But most of all, Mohammed was a coward, as are all Islamic imams today. They are ever ready to send others to their death, but never willing to fight themselves. They corrupt boys with promises of virginal rewards, while they remain in the comfort and safety of mosque and madrasa. Like most loud-mouthed bullies, Mohammed and those who followed him found pleasure in tormenting the defenseless. And with each passing day it became more evident that Mohammed had lost control of himself, and that he was overcome by men. The Medina surahs have been fixated on attacking the deserters of Islam. Orders to submit and obey dominate his final revelations. As men sought freedom and peace, Mohammed reacted by becoming more dictatorial and warlike. As a result, Islamic nations are the least free places on earth. In the land of submission, there are no true democracies, no freedom of religion, of the press, of speech, or travel. 1 billion Muslims struggled to survive in countries brutalized by tyrants, and it's not hard to see why. The first Muslims emulated their warlord, becoming increasingly belligerent, callous, and brutal. So that leads us to a very unattractive place. As a direct result of Muhammad's personal failings, the Islamic world is devoid of everything civilized people hold dear. Muslims wallow in poverty. Life isn't worth living. They have no freedom of speech or religion. With the educational process focused on Quranic studies, Muslims are among the most poorly educated and most indoctrinated people on earth. Following the example of a perverted sexist, Muslim men abused women, and they are violent. 20% of the world's population is responsible for 90% of the planet's upheaval, terror, and war. If only 20% of Muslims are good ones, then that makes them 2,000% more violent than the rest of us. Frankly, I don't see any benefit to any of this. Islam is a liability the world could easily do without. In the prologue of Prophet of Doom, I shared a pair of quotes from Islamic scholars. This might be a good time to review them in the context of what we have just read. What may once have seemed extreme will now appear understated. Here is what Dr. D.S. Margoloth had to say. Quote, "The character attributed to Muhammad in the biography of Ibn Ishaq is exceedingly unfavourable. In order to gain his ends, Muhammad recoils from no expedient, and he approves of similar unscrupulousness on the part of his adherents when exercised in his interests. He organizes assassinations and wholesale massacres. His career as the tyrant of Medina is that of a robber chief whose political economy consists of securing and dividing plunder. He is himself an unbridled libertine, and he encourages the same passion in his followers. For whatever he does, he is prepared to plead the express authority of his deity. It is, however, impossible to find any Islamic religious doctrine which he is not prepared to abandon in order to secure a political end. At different points in his career, he abandons the unity of God and his claim to the title of prophet. This is a disagreeable picture for the founder of a religion, and it cannot be pleaded that it is a picture drawn by the enemy." End quote. Renan wrote, "Muslims were the first victims of Islam. Many times I have observed that fanaticism comes from a small number of dangerous men who maintain others in the practice of this religion by terror. To liberate the Muslim from his religion is the best service one can render him."